Welcome, Admiral Bauer. You said about this Ukrainian war that it was a war of the past, a war of the future, in the present. What exactly do you mean by that?
Very often I hear from people that they say that the military is always preparing for the last war and that they actually should prepare for the future war. And then people think about high technology, cyber, information warfare, hybrid warfare. And we all thought that the Russians would play that type of warfare much harder. And in the end, we found out that they are using tactics and procedures from the First World War, 1914, 1918. Huge artillery barrages, indiscriminate destruction, firing on civilian infrastructure, firing on military positions, and without a lot of movement, but with a lot of destruction and killing. And at the same time, there is cyber, there is information operations, there is drones. So you actually see that we are fighting, the Ukrainians are fighting the war of the past, the war of the future today at the same time.
Were you surprised with the performance of the Russian army?
I think it's a combination of things. What was their biggest mistake is that they believed their own nonsense. So all the information, the disinformation that they sent out before the war, they actually believed they could be in Kiev in 3 to 5 days. So they really believed that. And in their planning, they therefore did not consider a longer conflict and therefore were not ready in terms of their own logistics when the war took longer than the 10 days they thought it was going to be. They thought it was going to be the 3-day war, and we're approaching the 1-year mark. So that is a remarkable mistake. So none of the strategic objectives of the Russians has been met, and then they attacked from too many different directions, so from the north, from the east and from the south, because they thought it was going to be a piece of cake. And then the resistance of the Ukrainians was a surprise to them. Then because they didn't prepare themselves well and told their own troops only 2 days before the invasion that they were not there for an exercise but to invade Ukraine. So the troops were unprepared on the tactical level, and they thought this is late February, so the ground must be frozen. But it was a soft winter that year, and therefore the vehicles and the tanks couldn't go in line to Kiev from the north, but had to cross on the one road, and that made them extremely vulnerable. So it's a combination of poor strategic planning and preparation, and I think the assumptions were wrong that they would be able to do this in a very short time.
Are they learning, the Russians, with their own mistakes?
I think they're not very successful yet, but we see some changes. I think we see that the retreat from the city that was done in a much better organized way than we thought they would be able to do that. So I think that in many ways they are learning, of course, from this war. But at the same time, we don't see that they're successful in reaching their strategic objectives.
Ukraine can win the war? They look pretty vulnerable at this point.
I think everyone looks pretty vulnerable. I think both sides suffer from similar problems, like ammunition is becoming an issue on both sides. There's a lot of casualties on both sides. There's a lot of both sides are becoming tired. If you're in a war for a year, so both sides are have similar problems. But the big advantage of the Ukrainians is they know what they're fighting for. That is the existence of their own country, the survival of their own country, and the Russian soldiers really don't have a clue what they're doing there and what they're fighting for.
Are they fighting for our values, the Ukrainians?
First and foremost, they fight for their own existence. But indirectly, they fight for what is dear to us, and that is being able, as a sovereign state, to be a sovereign state and to be able to defend your borders. And that if someone violates those basic rules of the international order, that you then step up and defend yourself. And I think that is very important for all of us, because this can happen to other nations than Ukraine. Many nations in NATO thought for decades that we were owning the timelines. We were the ones that decided to go to Afghanistan, to go to Iraq. It was a decision from NATO, from the NATO nations. And so we owned the timelines. We were saying, when are we going, with how many troops, for how long, etc. Now we are facing a threat, which is Russia, that is coming to us uninvited at a moment of their choosing. So we have to be much more ready. We have no time to prepare, because it is up to them when they come.
Do you believe that Russia, with this regime, will stop there, or do they want the backyard, the entire backyard, as they call it?
Well, they have shown us in a document. It was a concept treaty text in December 21. They sent us a text which basically said we had to go back to the pre-1997 situation. And that's what they're aiming for. That's their strategic objective. So this is not only about Ukraine. And it's funny how if people say to me, what happens if Russia loses Ukraine? It was never theirs. So it's funny how these formulations are being used. If you talk about something that is not yours and then you say, what is happening if I lose it? It was never theirs. So how can they talk about it like that? They shouldn't have been there in the first place. It's not their country, it's Ukraine.
But you don't believe that it's only about Ukraine?
No, it is about turning back to the old Soviet Union.
Okay, so the entire eastern flank of NATO is at risk somehow.
Yeah. I think this is about a deep frustration with Mr. Putin, who was present when the Soviet Union was lost, when first the Warsaw Pact, of course, fell apart, and then the Soviet Union, and he feels a deep frustration about that. And I think he's trying to get all of that back, or as much of that back, before he dies. I think this is about his legacy, and therefore this is not about Ukraine only. This is about that idea, and therefore we have to continue to support Ukraine, because if the Russians would win the war in Ukraine, we have a much bigger problem as NATO.
Do you believe do you see it as a long war, Admiral? This war can become
it is already a rather
war.
long war. I mean, we're approaching the 1-year mark. There's no signs on both sides that they are willing to go to the negotiation table. And therefore, for now, I think we're in this for the long haul. How long it will take, I honestly don't know. But there's no signs whatsoever on both the Ukrainian and the Russian side that they are willing to give in.
How decisive are those tanks that they are talking about now, those German tanks, on the battlefield?
Well, I think, and it comes back to this idea of hard power. So this is about kinetic warfare, which we thought we would not see that again in Europe, and we do see it. We see a lot of destruction. So if the enemy comes with a tank, it's good to have a tank yourself. So I think that is the logic, the military logic. So in that sense, I fully understand the request from Ukraine. I think we have come to the point where most of the former Soviet tanks that were in the inventory of NATO nations have been given away. So we are now reaching the point, if they need more, that they talk about other types of tanks, the more modern tanks, like the Leopards. And of course, the Leopards are performing superior to the Soviet tanks, and therefore it is something the Ukrainians want. That's logic from their point of view.
There might be an escalation, right? Now, Moscow is warning all the time, if that kind of equipment goes to Ukraine, there will be serious consequences. How serious are the Russian warnings? How do you take that?
Well, I think it's wise to take everything the Russians say seriously. because we see now they're not 11 feet tall, but they're also not 2 feet tall. So despite the fact that many of the things are not going well, Russia is a big country, has an ability to reconstitute their armed forces. So I think, and they've shown that in the past several times, so I think we should be not underestimate the ability of the Russians to do that. That's one. Second, with the rhetoric on escalation, we have to take it seriously, and we do. But so far, we have not seen any true preparations when it comes, for example, to nuclear.
If there is an escalation, are we ready, NATO is ready to manage that risk?
Well, it's interesting because I think the first escalation was the invasion. So if you talk about we're going to escalate because Ukraine tries to get back what is theirs, I don't see that as an escalation.
No?
No, I think it's an
offense.
It's a counteroffensive
Right?
of Ukraine,
Okay.
and they need the proper weapons to do that. And so, if part of the weaponry that they can use is modern Western weapons, then that is of course helpful for the Ukrainians. It's not. That's not escalatory in itself. I mean, the fact that your enemy has better weapons is not the problem of the enemy. That is your problem. So if you're on the Russian side, I understand the way they talk about it. But again, if they stop the war today, nothing will escalate further. So the fact that they are there in the first place, and the fact that they are continuing to stay there, is part of the reason why the Ukrainians have to fight back and try to get the Russians out of their own country.
We are ready to a direct confrontation with Russia.
We are. I think what we have done after the war started was the battle groups along the eastern flank. We had 4 in the north, the 3 Baltic states and Poland, the enhanced forward presence battle groups. We have decided now, the leaders in Madrid have decided to create 4 more battle groups in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and to basically strengthen those battle groups, make them a little bit larger, give them a little bit more support in terms of fire support, and give them better stocks for ammunition and other things. So I think that is an important message for the Russians, that our posture has changed, to show them that we are ready if they would have an idea to come to NATO. And that is the red line. If there is any red line, it is the Russians crossing the line of our territory in NATO.
I believe you said that we are ready to scale up, but that will require some focus. I believe it was your expression. What do you mean by that?
I said that with regard to industrial capacity,
okay.
the defense capacity. Because I think what we see on both sides is there's high use of ammunition. There's a lot of destruction in terms of vehicles and tanks and aircraft, and there's a lot of things that require to be bought on both sides to continue the fight in material and in ammunition. So the challenge for both sides is that the industries, the defense industries in the West and in Russia, need to ramp up production. And we basically have an economy now that is just in time, just enough. Everything we do in the West in the last 25 years was based on that idea. Having stocks was not smart because it was dead money. But we now see, so if you order a car, they will start the production after you ordered the car. And we're talking now that, hey, I'm using more ammunition than I thought. I need to take from a warehouse ammunition. So you're talking about stocks. You're talking about things that are there, not because you necessarily needed them, but once you need them badly, because the production in the battlefield is going up. And we saw in the pandemic with medical equipment and material. So we need to increase the production in the defense industry, and now more and more that is a discussion that is ongoing in the nations, but it might also require some prioritization in terms of certain raw materials, certain production facilities that are required for defense production instead of for civilian production. If you know that in the first 4 years of the United States, in the United States in the Second World War, in the Ford factories, there was no civilian cars made, but only military production. So I'm talking about focus in the sense that we have to have this debate on prioritization. And that is, in a way, talking about a wartime economy, but in peacetime. And that's difficult, of course.
That requires a big change in the European mindset.
Absolutely.
We thought that we were at peace. We were at peace for a long time, so nobody was somehow ready. Societies are not yet ready to face this. Do you think that that is essential to a change in the mindset? Because we might be facing a long war, and we need more weapons, more defensive systems.
If Ukraine loses the war, we have a much bigger problem in Europe. So we need to make sure that the Russians will not win the war in Ukraine. Because if they do, we have a much bigger problem in terms of money and defense. And then we have the Russians on our borders.
You mentioned resilience, the Ukrainian resilience. Do you believe that our societies are enough resilient to change the mindset about how much we need to step up our defenses?
I think humans have that unique ability to make that switch. But I think people need to understand that there is a necessity to do it. And so I think this is about convincing our people that it is necessary. And I think the people along the eastern flank in Poland, Baltic states, and in the southeast, Bulgaria, Romania, they feel, of course, the possibility of the Russians being close to their border again. And so the sense of urgency in those nations is higher, than, for example, here in Portugal, which is understandable on a human level, but therefore it's so important that on the political level and on the military side, people start to explain why it is so important, why it is necessary, and that the problems that occur in the eastern flank will also be felt here in Portugal. Because if Ukraine would lose the war, the costs of defense will go up also for Portugal, much more than now in any planning that is available now.
Do you see the possibility of Belarus joining the Russian army on the battlefield? Do you see that?
I think we have seen a certain reluctancy in Belarus so far. They are helping in a way, but so far not in a direct military support. So they have allowed the Russians to be on their territory. They are assisting the Russians to be trained now in Belarus. So they allowed the Russians to attack Ukraine from the north through Belarus. But it wasn't the Belarusian forces themselves participating in those operations. So
that might change? Do you believe that might change?
Everything might change, but I think there is severe resistance in the Belarus population, actually, to do this, because they don't want to get involved in this. As far as I understand, in the Belarus military, there's also not a lot of support to be directly involved in this war.
You already mentioned several times that this invasion created a new global security landscape. And China is, of course, crucial. They claim they have a friendship with no limits with Russia. How do you see the position on China on this? How crucial it is?
I think China is watching this very, very closely, because I think they thought the Russians would be able to win this war fairly quickly. I think they are probably surprised by the fact that that is not happening. So they have been supporting Russia. So they don't want Russia to lose the war, but they're not openly supportive in for example, through weapons or things like that, because There is a difference. So I think the Chinese are watching this conflict, watching the response from the world, from the 50 nations that are supporting Ukraine. They look at the sanctions, because all the nations that together form a pact in terms of the sanctions is more than 55% of the world's economic wealth in the world. And that is something that China also understands in terms of power. So it's not only about military power, this is also about economic sanctions and the effect on now Russia. But if that would go towards China in another conflict or in another situation, the Chinese understand that more than 55% of the world's wealth is still with those nations. So the combination of our support to Ukraine, the surprisingly poor performance so far by the Russian forces with their materiel, which is also bought by the Chinese, by the way, for a longer time. So it has an effect on what it means in that relationship. I don't think in strategic terms the Chinese-Russian relationship is a strong one in the longer term.
In the longer term.
In the longer term, I think the Chinese will not continue to depend too much on the Russians, I would expect. So all the nations in the world look at this conflict and are trying to learn lessons from it. And one of the things that it has done is that it has woken us up. It has woken us up because we thought this would never happen again in Europe. And it is there. And I think the people, we all were a little bit naive for decades. We need to do more to be ready, because the timelines are not owned by us, but by the opponent.
There was a very critical moment that we all recall, the moment where a missile fell down in Poland. And in those minutes, nobody was sure if it was Russia or not Russia, if we were in the presence of a Russia attack or not. Do you have a military channel, direct military channel to Moscow?
Oh, unfortunately, at the moment, no.
Not at that moment?
No. I thought to the Polish Jod, and the answer was yes. I phoned him. But no, I've tried to reach out.
In those moments, what really happened, if you can walk us through that critical moment?
Well, actually, what happens, and I'm proud of what the Polish government did, and in the end what NATO did, because this all happened at night. It was dark. It was raining, and so it was difficult to get to the location. And of course, there's a lot of confusion, and there's reports. And is it a Russian missile or not? Is it an attack? Is it the beginning of something else? Is it so? What was extremely important for the moment itself and for the follow-on was the fact that we all said, let's first look at the facts and then take a decision. Nobody rushed into any statement. So the Polish authorities, military and civilian, took their time to find out what had happened. And then the conclusion was it was a missile from the Ukrainian armed forces used to defend themselves against the Russian attack, which unfortunately then fell into Poland and killed 2 Polish citizens. And so what happens is that all the people that are on the political and the military level started to make phone calls to one another and to reassure each other and to make sure that we did the right things. And I think that was exactly what happened.
But you didn't have a military direct channel to Moscow.
No.
Do you have that now?
No.
No?
No.
So if you
So I reached out 3 times since I have arrived.
Okay.
And all the 3 times it was basically turned down by the Russians, which is unfortunate, because I think especially in moments of rising tensions, you want to make sure that
you can talk to somebody.
That you can talk to someone, and that you can find out if something is a mistake or, you know, if tensions rise, it's not a surprise that people make mistakes on a lower tactical level, for example. And if that happens, and it is not the intent of the higher leadership to go to war to NATO, but that it is indeed a mistake, then it is important to have that phone call and say, okay, we understand this is not your intent, to calm things down.
Are we ready for nuclear war? And do you believe in that possibility?
I think Vladimir Putin is not insane, so that's the good news. He has ideas that are not our ideas, but he's not insane. So he is still a rational person, and I think that is important with regard to the use of nuclear weapons. Well, I think it's extremely important that we all continue to agree on the fact that a nuclear war should not be fought and can never be won.
Admiral Bauer, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you.